Once your color management and your look are in place, exposure and contrast are by far the most important pieces of your grade. These adjustments should happen in one node. It should be the very first node that you hit, and that node should get you 80% of the way to your final image. Let me show you how I work and how I think my way through this very first node. So as we get into Resolve here, you can see I've got my template node graph in place, which we're not going to do much with today except for node number 1 here, which I've labeled prime. But I also want to show you how I've set things up so that I can do what I need to do here in node number 1. A moment ago, I mentioned color management and look. Those things for me are living here at the timeline level of my node graph. And you can see here, I've got my DRT or my output transform. This is coming from a free third-party tool called OpenDRT. And if I turn this off and then on, you can see that it's taking my graded image and actually mapping it and teeing it up for display so that it looks correct on my reference monitor, okay? Like I said, this is a free tool. I'll leave a link to it in the description for this video if you want to check it out for yourself. And then over here to the left, I have my look development plugin Contour, which is providing me my baseline creative look that is being used or applied to all of the shots in this timeline. So it's giving me my creative contrast curve, it's giving me some extra color separation, it's giving me some extra saturation, and really shaping out my image and giving me the strongest possible creative foundation so that I can dive right into node number 1, make those exposure and contrast adjustments, and get to that 80% point that I mentioned a moment ago really quickly and really easily. So with that said, let's go back over to the clip level of the node graph and dive into node number 1. So with node number 1, all we're trying to do is get our tonality feeling really, really good. Everything from deepest shadows up to our brightest highlights. And the way we're going to do that is by hitting exposure and then contrast. So let's bounce around. Let's go to a shot where we might need to do a little bit more, like shot number 6 here. And we're going to start with exposure. Exposure is where we begin, and it is always where we return when we are grading, okay? I'll tell you more about that in just a minute. But let's for now go over to my HDR palette, where I'm going to adjust my global exposure slider down here, okay? And I'm going to use this to get my exposure to a better spot. Now, first thing I want to emphasize is we're talking about exposure here. Exposure is a creative parameter. It is not a technical parameter at this stage, okay? There are best practices for exposing on a technical basis when you're shooting, but right now it is a creative parameter solely. How do I know when my exposure is good? When I like what I'm seeing and when my client likes what we're seeing. How do I know if it's bad? If we don't like it yet. That's all there is to it. You don't need to worry about any sort of arbitrary idea of correctness or incorrectness, okay? So I'm just going to swing this intentionally too far and then walk it back until I feel like I've got an exposure that I'm happier with. Now you might be asking like, okay, why HDR global? Why is that the adjustment? Why not any other adjustment? Could I use any other adjustment if I prefer? Let me walk you through that. So HDR global is one of 2 ways within Resolve that allow us to make an adjustment that's what's called photometric. All that means, it's a fancy word to tell us that it is going to do the same thing that we would get by opening or shutting our lens or by increasing or decreasing the amount of light that's actually being used on set. So it is a true exposure-only adjustment. And that's a really important feature when we're working our way, especially through node number 1 here, because we're going to be working exposure and then we're going to be working contrast. Yes, we are doing them in one node. We're doing them in one node because of how interactive they are and how much they play off of each other visually. But I still want to have the ability to work exposure and only exposure, and then work contrast and only contrast. And if I pick the wrong tool to adjust exposure, I'm actually going to be adjusting exposure and contrast simultaneously. Let me give you an example of this. So let's grab a still of what we just did, and I'm going to reset this node. And I'm now going to go back over to my primaries and work the first exposure-like tool that I was ever introduced to when I began grading, offset. So let's do this. I'm going to wipe to the HDR grade that we just did, and I'm going to try to match it with my offset. Maybe something like this. So let's make it a full frame wipe so we can compare, like so. I could go a little bit hotter on the offset actually. So something like that. So if we look at our offset exposure adjustment versus our HDR exposure adjustment. Offset, HDR global. What difference do you see? What's the difference between these two? Well, there's a difference in contrast, right? Now here's what's important. It is not important which of these you prefer. You might actually prefer the offset exposure adjustment that I made just here. But what's important is that the offset adjustment didn't just change my exposure, it also changed my contrast. It may so happen in this case that it changed the contrast in a direction you want to see it go, but the fact that I'm adjusting two things when I'm really only supposed to be adjusting one is going to make it difficult for me to work efficiently and quickly through node number one, and it's going to make it really hard for me to avoid chasing my own tail. Okay, so for that reason, we're going to stick with this HDR global adjustment. And this idea is going to come up even more strongly when we get into contrast next, okay? So now we've got our exposure in place, and looking at this with fresh eyes, I'm going to bring this back just a little bit, maybe to something like that. And we're now ready to start talking about about contrast. So thinking about contrast, the same principle is going to apply almost even stronger than it did with exposure, that when I'm adjusting contrast, I just want to adjust contrast. I don't want to also move exposure when I just got done setting exposure where I wanted it to be. Right? So let's take a look at our options here. I'll start with like the very first exposure adjustment tool that I was introduced to when I began grading, lift, gamma, and gain, right? Lift, gamma, and gain can work, but here's the thing. When you're adjusting lift, gamma, and gain, you're always going to be adjusting exposure. Like 99 out of 100 times, a lift, gamma, gain adjustment is going to bump exposure up or down a little bit while you're working through it, okay? So it's not the ideal choice if you're really trying to focus on one thing at a time. So what are some other options here? Well, another good one right here within our primaries would be contrast. So what if we take our contrast slider here and move this to the right? Well, what do we see happening in the image and in the histogram as I'm doing this? Feels like it's getting darker, right? But check this out. I'm going to show you a magic number. Check out this pivot box and check out what happens when I type in this magic number, 0.336. Let's actually, before we do that, let's go back to where we were. And I'm going to set my contrast off of 1. I'm going to go like heavy with the contrast. Now, when I set this to 0.336, watch what happens to the image. It gets brighter, right? But what's more important than it getting brighter or darker is that the pivot point of this contrast adjustment changes. Think about contrast. What are we fundamentally doing? We're taking everything below a certain point and dropping it further toward the floor. We're dropping like the contrast in that area, and then we're stretching it out on the other end, right? Changing this pivot simply changes the point around which that stretch is happening. 0.336, why is that a magic number? Because it just so happens to represent where middle gray lives within my working color space of DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate. What does that mean? That means that I'm going to be pulling shadows down and stretching highlights out around the middle gray of my chosen working color space, which means that in general, I will not be biasing exposure up or down. I will simply be increasing contrast around that middle gray pivot point. Does that make sense? This is a really easy, really powerful way to get contrast-only contrast adjustments that are not also going to bias the exposure choices that you literally just got done making a moment ago, okay? So let's back this off now and just kind of dial it in by eye. And there's a couple things that come up as we start looking at contrast through this lens and we start looking at imposing these parameters on ourselves. The first one is like, all right, so when I'm doing this, as soon as I start to move it to the right, I feel like, that's kind of too much. So here's like an interesting thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about exposure and contrast. I started this video today by saying like, hey, these are the most important key pieces of your color grade by the time you've got your color management and your look in place. That's 100% true. But what's interesting is just because they are the most important doesn't mean you need to do much or anything with them. It means you need to be keeping an eye on them. And especially when it comes to contrast, we are not trying to create or to remove contrast when we're grading in general at the shot level. What we are trying to do is maintain the contrast that we defined in our look. Okay, so remember, if we go back over here to the timeline level that I showed you a minute ago, I already have contrast happening right here. What I'm trying to do when I'm grading through my timeline is to maintain the ratio, to maintain the contrast curve that I liked and that I said this is the look for when we were building the project at the beginning. I'm just trying to keep the car on the road, okay? So just because exposure and contrast are highly important adjustments doesn't actually mean they need to be big adjustments, and in some cases you may not need any adjustment at all. And in the case of this shot, I would say like we don't really need much contrast. Like that represents the ratio that I'm looking to see, okay? That's one principle that can be helpful, is like just because you need to be very attendant to exposure and contrast doesn't actually mean you need to do anything. Here's another one. If you regularly are finding yourself having to increase or decrease contrast in one direction, like shot after shot after shot, like let's say you go through 5 shots in a row, and in every one of them you have to pull contrast back to get to a nice looking image, that's a really good clue that your overall look does not yet have the right contrast dialed in. It means you've probably got too much contrast of living in the overall look, and you want to go back and look at pulling some of that out, okay? So that's another really helpful principle to think about when it comes to working your way through your contrast at the local adjustment level. Now, I also want to circle back to this pivot point that we talked about a moment ago. So this is kind of a nifty trick that I showed you, but you may also be asking like, okay, great. So does that mean I'm going to spend the rest of my life double clicking on this pivot field and typing in 0.336 in order to get this cool contrast adjustment that you were showing me? No, there's a better way to go about this. In fact, if we look at my power grades here and I go to my trees and I look at my CKC base tree, you can see when I apply this tree that I previously saved, there's no grading happening in this tree. Like it's not doing anything to the image, but what it is doing is setting the pivot point to a custom position here in node number 1. So if I was starting this from 0 with my template node graph, I can simply go in and adjust my exposure like so, and I can then immediately go back over to my primaries and adjust my contrast, and it's automatically going to be pivoting around that middle gray point of 0.336. By the way, another question that might be coming up, how in the world did you know that that's the number, 0.336? To get that number, I referenced my MidGrey cheat sheet. That's a free resource that I will also leave a link to in the description for this video. It lists the middle gray point, that magic middle gray point, for a number of different color spaces that you might choose to work in so that you can easily reference it and type it right into that pivot point regardless of the space that you're working in. I work in DaVinci Intermediate. That's what I recommend here on the channel. If that's what you are working in, it's 0.336. But if you want to have a handy place to keep that available to yourself, go grab the MidGrey cheat sheet and it'll always be right there nearby when you need to grab it, okay? So that's a way that you can accelerate your process here. Really, a lot of what we're doing here in node number 1 is figuring out a repeatable, consistent, efficient way to get the very best results as quickly as possible, okay? So with this pivot set to 0.336, I can get my exposure dialed in, I can set that contrast and get to a really good spot with it very quickly, okay? So that's the basic flow here. And you can see like we can start to work through this at a bit more speed of like, all right, let's set our exposure. And then I'm going to go in and set my contrast and get things looking good really fast. And that's the basic flow of what we're trying to do with this very first node. Is we're just trying to get that tonality feeling really good by working exposure and then by working contrast and by working them with tools that are not going to create the need for compensation and end up getting me chasing my own tail, okay? Now, a couple questions come up along the way as we're going through this workflow or as you're learning this workflow for the very first time. One of them we've touched on a little bit, but I want to speak to it explicitly about why exactly we are doing exposure and contrast adjustment right within this same node. Wouldn't it be better to do those adjustments in 2 separate nodes? Here's my reasoning. We just got done walking through a process where I show you hitting just exposure and then just contrast and treating them as separate pieces. But here's the thing, at the end of the day, what matters, like let's take a look at shot 13 here. What matters at the end of the day is not one of those pieces, but both of those pieces. So if I open up just my exposure here, well, this is gonna feel too milky and too open until I also adjust my contrast, okay? So this doesn't matter to me as much as this right here, where I'm also, let's get this base tree in place here and actually try that again so that I'm pivoting around the right spot. So there's my exposure. And what I'm saying is this doesn't matter as much as this. It's the net of the way the exposure and the contrast interact with each other that really matters. That's why I like to do these things in one piece, because ultimately I want to just be able to flip the whole thing off and on and see what I've done, okay? Now, you don't have to do it this way. If you really prefer to do exposure in one node and then contrast in another node, the color grading police are not going to come and arrest you. I won't tell. That's totally cool. What I would encourage you to do is, even if you're doing that, and even if you like enabling and disabling just your contrast node, and then enabling and disabling just your exposure node, and looking at those pieces in isolation, before you move on, like check this out. I'm going to set my contrast back to 0. And let's say that I'm going to work in that way as well. Like, all right, we're just going to do our exposure here, and then we're going to do our contrast in a separate node. Before you move on from your exposure and your contrast adjustments that you should be doing at the very beginning of your process, before you move on, do yourself a favor and grab both nodes. and enable and disable the net of what they're both giving you, and make sure that in net, they're doing exactly what you want and getting you to that 80% point that I've mentioned a couple times today, okay? It's just a really good practice to get into because that's what matters more than just exposure or just contrast. Now, here's another big one. This comes up a lot when people are first learning this workflow. This is all good and well, Cullen, if it's nicely shot material on a high-end camera like we have here, but what if the material isn't as well shot, or if it's not shot on as good of a camera? Can I still really expect to get to 80% done in my very first node? My answer would be yes, absolutely. And I want to shift your perspective a little bit on that idea of 80% done. That's less something that we need to strive and stretch for and try to make happen. Like, I got to get this to 80% done by the time I'm past node 1. That's really just something that always happens. So like, however far you get in node number 1, that represents 80% of how far you're ever going to get in that grade. Does that make sense? By the time you've got your color management, your look, your exposure, and your contrast dialed in, the DNA of that image, of that grade, is set. And even though we've got this whole galaxy of nodes and tools and other adjustments that we can make when we're grading, the DNA has been defined by that point. So it's less of something that's like, you need to make sure you do that, and it's more something you need to recognize. Like, hey, whatever I'm at right now, this is 80% of where I'm ever going to get, so I need to make sure it's as good as it can possibly be, especially if I'm working with challenging footage, because that's going to be your best opportunity to get it into a good place, is to get things to that 80% point early in that process where you've got all that firepower at your disposal. Because trust me, after this point, even with all the power and the flexibility that we have within software like Resolve, your ability to influence the DNA of the grade really, really falls off after that very first node. So yes, even if your footage is lower in quality, or if it's more mixed in terms of like how well it was shot, I would say even more so if that's the case, you really want to focus in on getting as far as you possibly can in this very first node, because that's going to be the easiest place to bias the outcome in a direction that you want to see it go, okay? I want to show you one more thing before we wrap today. This is a fun final tweak that we're going to make here. So I'm going to do something in a separate node to show it to you, and then I'm going to show you how you can roll it up and make it all a part of this very first node. Here's what I want to do. Let's take a look back to, I don't know, like let's look at shot number 6 here, where we've just got a lot of deep shadows in this project that I'm grading today. And the deep shadows are beautiful, but something that we want to be mindful of when we're grading is we really want to hold on to detail, and we want to create softness and shape in the low end of the image and in the high end of the image. So even though we've got strong contrast through the middle, we want to make sure we're not too harsh in the bottom or in the top. And I'm going to show you a trick for achieving that right within this node. We're going to start by doing it in a separate node, and then we're going to compact it all together, okay? So let me just go to node number 9 for now. Now track with me, there's a few steps here, but it ends up being very simple. So I'm going to go to my utility power grades folder, and I'm going to grab my DaVinci wide gamut gray power grade here. All this is an instance of my exposure chart DCTL, another free resource I'll leave a link to in the description for this video. And I've set my total steps to 1. I've turned off show ramp, and I've set my tone curve to DaVinci intermediate. Why have I done all that stuff? So that I have nothing in the world but a pure patch of middle gray right here in my image. And all I'm going to do with this is go back over to node number 9 and go to my custom curves and eyedropper anywhere on this gray patch, okay? Like so. Now that I've done this, I can actually wipe out node number 12. All I needed it for was to very precisely position this anchor point, because I now know that's my middle gray. So if I don't move this point, then I won't be moving exposure when I make this contrast finesse adjustment that I'm about to make. Same rules apply as with the contrast adjustment we were making a moment ago. I don't want to inadvertently adjust exposure when I'm really trying to adjust contrast, okay? So once I've got this in place, what I can do is shape out the bottom of the image. I'm just going to pick up the bottom and then add some compression, like so, and then kind of walk that back to taste so that I've got just the amount that I'm really looking for here, okay? Something like that feels really nice. And I can flip that off and on, and you can see I'm just getting a little bit more softness down in the low end. Now, here's the fun thing. This is again where thinking your way through what you want your node tree to be, what you want your process to be when you're grading, can be really beneficial. I like to do this so much that I've actually got it baked into node number 1. I've saved off this MidGrey anchored custom curve into node number 1. You might have actually noticed the little curve icon on my template node tree when I load it in here. If I pull this up, you can see even before I've done anything, this curve icon is there. It's not because anything's actually happening here. It's because I've saved off this MidGrey anchored custom curve into my node tree, so that when I'm working my way through a shot, like shot number 6, I don't even need to do what I was doing here in node number 9. Right here within node number 1, if I want to, if I need to, I can go in here and I can shape out the contrast in the low end of the image, okay? Really powerful way to finesse things in the bottom of the top. This is a great recipe, something to take away from everything we've talked about today. If you're thinking about contrast and how to win with contrast and tonality, as we're trying to do here in node number 1, a pretty bulletproof recipe that you will see in all kinds of images, in big movies and big shows, and that you can apply to almost any kind of footage that you would want to grade, is to have strong contrast through the middle, and then softer shaped contrast in the very low end in the shadows and in the very high end in the highlights. So you're holding on to a little bit of detail there and nothing feels harsh or clipped or clamped. So hope that's a pretty fun walkthrough of the basics of exposure and contrast, and then a little bonus here of kind of how to trim that lower, that bottom end when you need to, and how to set yourself up to be able to efficiently do so whenever you need to. This is the way that I like to work my way through the process. And again, I want you to think about your exposure and your contrast and everything that you're doing in node number 1. It's not like you need to stretch and make sure you're getting to 80% of the way done. You got to recognize that that just is 80% of the ball game right there. So you want to make sure to make it count.